Abhi, she's going to join back again. So every financial transaction is a combination of, oh, Amal has joined. Okay, great. Every financial transaction is a combination uh, of an action and a counterbalancing reaction. We saw that in effect from 1.11 to 1.14. But now we are going to formally introduce it, and we are not going to use plus or minus signs or upward arrow or downward arrow, but we are going to sort of translate those into accounting language. So every financial transaction is a collective whole reflecting two key aspects. We already know about that. Just for a revision, for the sake of revision, take it. Every financial transaction has two key aspects. So एक transaction को जब आप as a whole देखते हैं, तो as a whole, तो वो एक event लग रहा है, लेकिन वो event असल में दो sub events पे consist करता है. And these two key aspects of every transaction, we can identify them as an economic benefit and economic cost. Economic benefit is the motivation behind that transaction. अगर आपको कोई motivation नहीं है, अगर आपको कोई financial incentive नहीं है, तो फिर आपको उस transaction में involve होने की ज़रूरत नहीं है. So every time there is a transaction that happens, not every time, most of the cases, that's the situation in accounting. Most of the cases when a transaction happens, there has to be some sort of an incentive or a motivation behind that. And that incentive is provided by the economic benefit involved, right? And it is not possible for you to identify, to have the economic benefit enjoyed and not bearing the cost of the same benefit. The benefit and cost are always going to be there. You just have to identify them. You need to learn to identify them, because these are the two key aspects, or these are the action and reaction that we are talking about in Newton's third law of motion. So what do we mean by that? Let's take this example, some examples to understand this. So every transaction is a collective whole that represents two aspects. One represents the economic benefit, or we can say it's the upside or the brighter side of the picture, right? We can say aspect one represents the upside or the brighter side of the story, or the action, and aspect two is the reaction of that action, which represents the economic cost, or represents the darker side of the picture, or represents the downside. So every transaction is a collective whole. One aspect is the upside or the brighter side of the story, and the other aspect tells you about the darker side of the story. You cannot have a complete transaction without the two. So that is what the principle of duality is, that you need to identify the key aspects of the transactions and identify them, and then learn to record them. Recording part is going to come later on. So let's say this is the same familiar transaction that we see in the beginning of every question in chapter number 2, chapter 1. The owner started the business by investing $50,000 cash. So what do you think? What is the first aspect or the brighter side of the picture here, or upside here? You can write your answer in the text if you can identify what's the upside here or first aspect here. The brighter side. पहले तो हम सिर्फ effects detect कर रहे थे ना, अब हम उन effects को categorize भी करेंगे कि does it represent the brighter side of the story or the darker side of the story. So the upside here, Asma says, increase in capital. Capital increases. Is that the upside or the downside? That's the question here. Increase in cash, Madiha. That's good, right? Upside is when you gain more assets. The downside is when you gain in the obligations, right? Capital is an obligation, that is true. So downside, excellent Alicia Azim, I agree with that. Alina Vakas says money for assets. Yeah, that is the upside. That our upside is that the asset cash is increasing by $50,000. That's the upside here. That's the economic benefit or the motivation behind this transaction here. And the downside is that for the business entity, remember everything has to be analyzed from the business entity's perspective. So business entity के point of view से आपने ये बताना है कि अपसाइड या डाउनसाइड क्या होगी तो बिजनेस को किस चीज़ के अंदर बेनिफिट मिल रहा है इस वक्त उसके कैश एसेट इंक्रीज कर रहा है सो दैट शुड बी द अपसाइड हियर एंड you can't have the upside without the downside. And the downside is that if your assets increase by $50,000 at the same time, your obligation is also increasing by $50,000. So that's how the duality principle balances out the accounting equation. So we understand the first transaction and its analysis. Then give me a green check on the participants list. Good. Thank you. Good. Amal, नहीं समझ आया बेटे? Minal, Amal, Madiha, Hadia. ओके गुड हादिया आपको जब आप participants की जब आप अपनी Zoom विंडो पे participants को टैप करते हैं तो वहाँ पर आपके पास ये नॉन वर्बल फीडबैक की ऑप्शंस नीचे होंगी ग्रीन चेक फॉर येस रेड क्रॉस फॉर नो रेज हैंड एटसेट्रा राइट सो यू कैन ऑलवेज गिव मी योर फीडबैक ओवर देयर ओके थैंक यू हादिया the next transaction, so read it carefully. Aspect 1 is the upside. So bought a vehicle paying by check $6,000. This is again, we've seen very common, this is a very common transaction in chapter 1. So what's the upside here? Aspect 1. ठीक है? Upside आपने मुझे बतानी है. You're the business entity. From your perspective, what is the brighter side of the picture here? How would you analyze the brighter side of the picture here? The asset is increasing vehicle, Alicia Azim. Thank you. Let's wait for other. The vehicle asset is increasing. Maheen, Marceline, thank you. Anyone else? We understand that? Or if you agree with Alicia or Maheen's answer here, you can always give me a green check on the participant window and save yourself from a lot of typing. Increase in the asset vehicle, Asma. I also agree with that. So the upside is the asset called vehicle is increasing and it increases by 6,000 and you see the dollar values mentioned next to it which will actually demonstrate the exact equilibrium like in the first transaction if your asset increases by 50,000 your obligation increases by 50,000 at the same time. So the upside is the asset is increasing by called vehicle is increasing by $6,000 and what's the downside here? Okay, the downside is the decrease in cash says Alicia Azim. Asma says decrease in capital. Okay. Maheen cash, which is another asset, also decreases. Excellent. Good answer. Asma, it's not capital. Capital by definition means what you, the business entity, owes back to your owner. Right? In this case, there is no active involvement of owner's contribution in the business or owner's withdrawals from the business, right? So cash falls by $6,000, Mudia. Excellent, very good. So the upside is that you are getting a vehicle as an asset, so your asset or vehicle is increasing, but at the same time, another asset called cash is falling, right? So that is your downside. The asset cash decreases by $6,000, right? Good. Now, next transaction. Bought machinery on credit from XYZ Limited, $10,000. Now, how do we identify the brighter side here? What's the brighter side for you here, right? It's not just where you have to identify two effects like 1.11 to 1.14. We need to identify those two effects as the upside or downside. So Alicia Azim's Maheen, the asset machinery increases by $10,000. I agree with that. Yes, Asma, increase in the asset machinery by $10,000. Excellent. Very good, Iman. asset is increasing, but Iman, be specific which asset is increasing and by what amount, right? We need to give all the details here, right? So machinery on credit from XYZ Limited, $10,000. The upside is the asset of machinery is increasing by $10,000. Thank you, Madiha. Right, good, excellent. And what's the downside here? What's the darker side here? If we have achieved something, there must be a catch to it. And the catch in this case is, Alicia says, your creditors are increasing by $10,000. Madhya says, creditors are increasing $10,000. Yes, I agree. Credit liability, Maheen Marcelin says, a credit liability is increasing by $10,000. Very good. Asma says increase in the liability creditor by $10,000. Excellent. So in this case, the liability towards XYZ Limited or the creditor XYZ is increasing, and that is our correct answer. We have identified the downside and the upside as well. So basically, in duality principle, or not just that you have to identify that there are two aspects, you need to learn to categorize these aspects as well, whether this is the upside or downside. अभी हम इन upside or downside को formal terms assign कर देंगे, but right now all we have to do is we need to identify ourselves which is the upside and what's the downside, and so that we can identify both the aspects of the duality principle. Great, Iman, excellent. Iman, Asma, excellent. Right. So now the next transaction, the owner withdrew $1,000 cash. The owner withdrew $1,000 cash for personal use, right? The owner withdrew $1,000 cash for personal use. So what is happening now? What's the upside and what's the downside, right? Let's not worry about aspect 1 and 2. Let's see what's the upside and the downside. What's the economic benefit and what's the economic cost involved here, right? Okay, so in Madiha says drawings are increasing by 10,000. Is that the upside or downside? Capital decreases by $1,000. That's the upside. Capital decreases by $1,000. That's the upside. Or basically, our obligation is decreasing by $1,000. Drawings आप जैसे मदीहा ने लिखा कि drawings increase कर रही है. So basically, drawings increase करने का मतलब ये है कि आपकी obligation decrease कर रही है owner की तरफ. So the upside over here, we have identified the upside correctly, that our obligation towards the owner, which we call capital or drawings, is going down because of this event. We owe less to our owner, and that is going down by $1,000. It decreases, right? And the downside here is there is no upside, Alicia. There is always going to be an upside or downside. You can't have a transaction. You can't have a transaction's existence without an upside or a downside. It is not possible. Just like there is no possibility of the existence of light without the existence of darkness, right? So the upside is the obligation of capital, obligation called capital, which means you owe your owner. That is going down now because you owe less to your owner. Your owner has withdrew $1,000 of cash, and the downside is that the asset called cash, you're losing it at the same time. So the upside is your obligation goes down, and the downside is your asset is also going down. Okay, understood? Good. Now the last example here before we move on to the problem solving. So repaid XYZ Limited's debt $10,000 by check. We are talking about the same transaction here. Sorry, this one. We bought machinery on credit from XYZ Limited earlier on, and the same XYZ Limited is what we owed earlier on, and now we are settling our debt by $10,000 check. So what is the upside? Decrease in the liability. Excellent. Trade payables falls. Excellent. Madiha and ठीक है. So yes, credit goes down. Maheen Marceline, creditors go down. Maybe you probably would want to say that creditors go down. Alicia Azim, debtor asset decreases by 10,000. Debtor is an asset. In this case, the debt is not to be confused by a debtor, right? You see, debt over here simply means someone owes someone else, right? So in this case, we owed a debt of $10,000 to XYZ. So let's not confuse the term debt with the debtor. Debtor has a specific meaning. Debtor means a person who owes us, and there is no other understanding of that. But debt is a general expression. Debt means someone owes someone else, right? So in this case, we owed XYZ Limited and we settled our debt to them by check. So the correct answer is that our obligation or liability towards XYZ Limited is decreasing by $10,000. That's the brighter side of the story. And the darker side of the story should be, excellent Asma, we are losing balance and cash from our bank account, $10,000. Our bank account is decreasing. Excellent Alicia, excellent Madiha, bank decreases. We understand it's quite obvious. So what we conclude from here is, number one, a transaction cannot simply exist without these two aspects. Without the upside or downside, a transaction cannot exist. And it is not possible for you to have just the upside and there is no downside, or just the downside and no upside. It is impossible. You can think of any other transaction in your head, and you will always find some upside or downside over here. Even if we are talking about non-financial aspects, as in हम जरूरी नहीं कि financial transactions की बात कर रहे हैं. अगर हम non-financial transactions की बात भी कर रहे हैं, तो भी आप upside और downside हमेशा होगी वहाँ पे, right? For example, you gave some food to a poor beggar on the street, right? There is an upside. The upside is that you did it for the incentive of maybe in the hereafter, Judgment Day पे आपने, okay Amna, you can leave now, right? ठीक है. There is an upside, and the upside is that there was an incentive that motivated you for this particular sort of non-financial transaction, and that is sawab कह लें आप उसको, या incentive for heavens कह रहे हैं, paradise or whatever. ठीक है. That provoked you, that motivated you to go for this particular act. And the downside is that you lost some resource of yours called food, extra food जो otherwise consume हो सकती थी, but you lost that. So the upside and downside is always going to be there. We have so many different expressions for that. What goes around comes around, tit for tat. There are so many ways of putting it. Give and take. It's always going to be there. So duality principle simply says that a transaction number one cannot exist without the two aspects. You can't have just the upside and no downside, and you can't have just downside and no upside. They will always be there, and they will always be equal to each other. Financial perspective, say, financial point of view, say, they will always be each other. You can see in all these examples, if there was an upside worth 50,000, there was a downside worth 50,000, and so on and so forth in every transaction, right? Now, we are going to now identify these aspects, or upsides and downsides. We're not going to refer to them as generic expressions of upward arrow, downward arrow, upside, downside, brighter side, darker side. We are going to have a very specific terms describing these effects now, and that introduction is going to be our introduction to the accounting language, the double entry system. जब भी हमने transactions record करनी, double entry system is basically a system of transaction recording. हमारा सबसे पहला स्टेप लर्निंग फेज के अंदर सबसे पहला स्टेप ये होता है कि हम ये देखते हैं हम ट्रांजैक्शंस को किस तरह से रिकॉर्ड करेंगे. सो वी आर गोइंग टू रिकॉर्ड द ट्रांजैक्शंस बेस्ड ऑन डबल एंट्री प्रिंसिपल, एंड डबल एंट्री मीन्स रिकॉर्डिंग बोथ दीज एस्पेक्ट्स ऑफ द ट्रांजैक्शन, जो भी हमने एग्जाम्पल में देखा है, जो हमने 1.11 से 1.14 की exercises में देखा. So double entry system simply is a system of recording transactions which actually ask you to record both aspects of transactions. You can't ignore any of the two aspects. So double entry bookkeeping system requires both aspects of transactions to be recorded, and we need to devise a systematic method of identifying and recording the two aspects of every transactions. We are going to learn chapter 1, 2, 3, 4 तक हम इस डबल एंट्री सिस्टम को और इस प्रोसीजर को जब हम बुक खरीद लेंगे तो हम इस प्रोसीजर को डिटेल में देखेंगे किस तरह से हम एक सिस्टमैटिक तरीके से इन ट्रांजैक्शंस के दोनों एस्पेक्ट्स को ब्राइटर साइड को भी डार्कर साइड को भी अप साइड एंड डाउन साइड एवरीथिंग वी विल लर्न हाउ टू रिकॉर्ड देम फॉर्मली but before we do that we know that since there are only two aspects we need to first define them in a specific in our accounting language. This is like learning a new language actually, right? And luckily this language में सिर्फ दो words होंगे, not upside and downside, but we will call them these effects. We are going to denote these effects with either a debit or a credit. It's a debit denoted by DR and credit which is denoted by CR. So we are going to record aspect 1, aspect 2 or upside or downside as debit or credit. Debit is not to be confused with debt. Debt is a separate thing, debit is something else. Similarly, the credit that we are using over here needs not to be confused with the credit expression we use in the examples that bought goods on credit for $5,000. That is something else. That credit is an English language credit, right? This credit over here is a Latin language word. I'll explain the meaning of debit and credit. These terms are what we are going to use to record the effects of all the transactions in a double entry system. So double entry system in essence is essentially almost exactly like the binary language that we use in machine learning and machine coding, zeros and ones, right? So अब हम इन transactions के effects को debits और credits की form में record करना सीखेंगे. So what do we truly mean by debit and credit? These terms evolved from the city-states जब Renaissance period के अंदर industry boom कर रही थी. So उस वक्त language of the business language used to be Latin. So most of the terms that we see in our business environment we use frequently, unki roots usually Latin se hain. These debit and credit are also Latin language words which simply mean left and right. Debit is left and credit means right. So what left and right we're talking about? We're talking about the accounting equation. Left hand side of the accounting equation and right hand side of the accounting equation. So assets equals equity and liability. It's the same conclusion which we are being referring to since our first chapter. So assets equals equity and liability. The left hand side of this equation is what we call the debit side or left side. We don't use the term lefts and right, but debit side means the left side of the equation, credit side is the right side of the equation. Now we are going to expand this equation a bit more, and now based on the mathematical rules which govern this equation, we are going to derive the rules for double entry. Double entry rules जो होंगे हम इसी mathematical equation की further expansion से create करेंगे. Now the first step in expansion of this equation is the term equity. We know equity is it consists of sub-elements. So what are those elements? You agree with this transaction, with this expansion of the term equity? If you understand this, we discussed it, I think, in the third lesson, probably sometime. So do we understand what equity is? If you agree, the expansion of equity, please give me a green check on the participants window. If you don't, हो सकता है मैं भूल रहा हूँ, मैंने किसी और क्लास में इक्विटी डिफाइन की हो, लेकिन मेरा ख्याल में मुझे याद पड़ता है कि हमने इक्विटी डिस्कस की थी. Equity in general means what you owe to your owner or owner's stake in the business or business's obligation to the owner. And that business's obligation can have three possible sub-explanations. The capital represents what the business owes to its owner because of the इनिशियल इन्वेस्टमेंट्स, जब बिजनेस स्टार्ट हुआ था तो इनिशियली जो ओनर ने कैपिटल इंट्रोड्यूस किया था. So your equity is your obligation towards your owner, and that obligation will increase because the owner contributed initially. And then profit also, अगर आप कोई बिजनेस में प्रॉफिट बनाएंगे तो वो उससे भी आपकी obligation owner की तरफ increase कर जाएगी. So that will also mean your the part of the equity. That's why we have a plus sign over here. So equity will increase because of capital and profit that the business entity makes, and the equity is going to go down, negative sign over here, because of the withdrawals. We call those withdrawals as drawings, right? आदिया बेटे, आपने सबने चेक कर दिया, आपने नहीं चेक किया. Do you understand that equity means capital plus profit minus drawings? Okay. So basically, equity means what you owe to your owner. Your obligation towards your owner will increase because of these two factors, and your obligation towards owner will decrease because of this factor. अभी हमने पिछली स्लाइड के अंदर एक ड्राइंग्स की एग्जांपल देखी. So that means we can now write this equation like this. And in this equation, we see a negative element over here, negative drawings. So what we are going to do is we are going to eliminate all these negative elements. And how do we eliminate the negative elements? We are going to take it on the other side, right? So the equation will eventually become assets plus drawings equals capital plus profit plus liabilities. So we agree with the third state of this equation. Please give me a green check if you agree with the third state of this equation. Assets plus drawings equals capital plus profit plus liabilities, right? We are simply shuffling the items around to avoid any negative sign. Understood? अमल नहीं समझ आया बेटे? मिनाल and Amal, आपको नहीं समझ आया? Good. Thank you. Everyone else has given me a green check. Good. So now we are going to further expand this equation now. Now the next element in focus is profit. We haven't really seen profit yet. और अभी अगले चैप्टर में भी शायद हम नहीं देखेंगे. उससे अगले चैप्टर में हम शायद देखेंगे प्रॉफिट को, राइट? थर्ड चैप्टर में हम जाके, जब आप बुक खरीद लेंगे तो उसके थर्ड चैप्टर में हम जाके प्रॉफिट को डिटेल में देखेंगे, हम प्रॉफिट कैसे कैलकुलेट करते हैं, राइट? सो प्रॉफिट, however, you need to understand profit is not something कोई rocket science नहीं है. So we do understand profit is every time what we earn exceeds what we spend on that earning. So अगर हमारी incomes or revenues is the other term that we use for income. So if our revenues or income is more than what we spend, those spendings are what we call expenses. So if our incomes are more than our expenses, we will have a profit. But if it is otherwise, if expenses exceed the income, we will have a negative profit. We call it a loss, right? So we are now going to expand the term profit here. So we understand this part. Profit is basically revenues minus expenses. We've expanded this equation further, right? So revenues is another term that we use for incomes. You could use incomes. I could have written over here incomes as well. So profit is basically your incomes. Business जिन sources से incomes कमाता है, और जिन आपकी जो बिजली के बिल हैं, आपकी employees की wages हैं, आपके transportation expenditures हैं. These are all different types of expenses. We will discuss all of them in chapter number 4 in detail. But right now we just need to have a basic introduction. So we agree with this profit expansion here. Give me a green check here if you agree with this evolution of accounting equation. Our accounting equation is evolving. It is revealing more of its secrets, and it is introducing us with more and more terms here. Okay, all agree. Excellent, excellent, very good. So now we have another negative element here. So we don't like negative elements in our accounting equation. So how are we going to get rid of these expenses? This is going to go to the other side of the equality as well. So we will move expenses to the other side of the equation, left side of the equation now, and our accounting equation's final shape will look like this. So assets plus drawings plus expenses are always going to be equal to capital plus revenues plus liabilities. Revenues is incomes here, right? We understand the final state of our accounting equation here? Good. Asma, thank you. Who else? Please give me a green check if we understand the final state of our accounting equation here, right? Excellent. Amal and Madiha. Amal? Madiha has checked. Amal? Probably Amal ka internet side respond nahi kar raha. Anyway, so now we come back to our debit and credit. So in Latin terms or in accounting double entry language, the new language that we are going to use, that language has just two words: the debit and the credit. That means to every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. And now in accounting we are going to denote these actions and reactions with accounting language, accounting terms, which is debit and credit. Debit simply means left, and credit simply means right. And debit, left, and right means now this final conclusion here. So, in double entry bookkeeping or in accounting in general, assets, drawings, and expenses, they are set to have a debit nature by default. Okay, ठीक है. Okay, Amal, I got it. So you can always write in text if you have any problem. You can always write in text. Yeah, ठीक है. Just a sec. Okay, forget it. So assets, drawings, and expenses, since they naturally exist on the left side of the accounting equation, we call them to have a debit nature by default. Their default nature is debit. That's how we refer to them in our double entry rules, or in accounting language, we will refer to them as carrying a debit nature by default. And capital, revenues, and liabilities, they exist on the right hand side of the equation. We will refer to them as carrying a credit nature by default. So an asset has a debit nature by default, capital has a credit nature by default, right? Drawings and expenses, they do have debit nature by default, and revenues and liabilities on the other side, they will have a credit nature by default. It may seem that these rather strange items getting together on one side of the equation, which don't seem to be connected with each other, assets, drawings, and expenses, इनका कोई direct connection आपको नजर नहीं आ रहा. Why do they have the same nature? Their default inherent nature is debit. All of them they share one thing, and that is their inherent nature is debit. We don't see any connection. Assets का drawings के साथ क्या connection हो सकता है? Drawings का expenses के साथ क्या connection हो सकता है? Same goes with the credit side. It looks strange. All of these three items, three different categories of accounts that we deal with, all of them have one thing in common, and they all have credit nature by default. Inherently, by nature, they all are carrying a certain aspect common with each other. But we don't see that common thread here connecting these three items here. It's a difficult question, and I do not expect you to answer this correctly. But if I ask you to detect that connection, let's take one side. Let's take credit side first. Credit side पे capital है, revenue है, liability है, right? इनमें एक connecting link क्या हो सकता है जिसकी वजह से ये तीनों चीजें they share this common basis. They are all naturally credit natured items, right? So can you detect that connection? What makes them carrying the same nature by default, which is credit? It's a difficult question, but if you can detect that link, that'll be amazing. So take your time and tell me. All of them help bring something back to business. Interesting, Mahi. Interesting. Okay, let's wait for some more Options here. Anyone? Incomes inject money in the business. So we are getting there. Yeah. So we are getting there. There's one more answer. They all bring cash back. Yeah, we're getting there. So we see if we really apply our mind, we find that common basis here. Capital, revenues, and liabilities. We won't use the term cash because necessarily cash ज़रूरी नहीं है. But I'm very happy, Maheen, Madiha, Asma, that क्या इन तीनों चीजों में क्या ऑप्शन कॉमन है दे ऑल हेल्प यू रेज फंड्स I'm using the term funds very carefully over here because funds is more generic. When you use the term cash in your answer here, Minal and Asma, आपने cash yes ज़रूरी नहीं है cash capital ज़रूरी तो नहीं है cash की form में inject हो सकता है owner अपनी personal motor vehicle business में invest कर दे. In that case, the business is getting an asset. That's the upside. And the downside is the business owes to its owner. But now you're not receiving cash from the owner. You're receiving a motor vehicle from the owner. You could receive furniture from the owner or anything, right? So capital, but one thing is common, that capital है या revenues हैं या वो liabilities हैं. All of them help you generate funds, and funds is a term which could mean any asset. They all represent generation of funds, right? So that's the common basis they have, and that is what makes them share this inherent nature of being credit, right? They all help the business entity generate finances. Do we understand the credit side of the accounting equation? That what is the common feature that connects the three items together? All of these help the business entity to generate funds, right? And funds mean anything. Funds could mean cash, it could mean a motor vehicle, it could mean furniture, fixtures, anything. Okay, so Asma understands, Maheen understands, Minal understands. But what about the rest? Iman understands. Good. Alicia, give me a green check, please, everyone, if you understand it. Okay, Misha, you understand better? Amal? Acha, Amal ka wo nahi kar raha. Okay, Amal, I will assume that you understand it unless you will write in the chat box that you don't understand something. Okay, Amal? Good. Acha, Minal Azim has put something here. They are a source of cash. Minal Azim, they are a source of funds. I would say cash is being very specific. But zaruri nahi ki cash bhi generator. Funds is a more general term. Funds could mean cash or funds could mean other assets other than cash. Yeah. Right. Acha. So now comes the debit side. What is the debit side now? If you have noticed, what we are doing, we have started with a very basic understanding of the accounting equation. क्या assets simply resources होते हैं और वो finances उनको provide करते हैं. हमने वहाँ से शुरू किया था. अब हम उसको बड़ी अब उसकी मतलब हम उसको ज़्यादा डिटेल में हम उसको ज़्यादा रिफाइन करते जा रहे हैं अपने एनालिसिस को अब आहिस्ता आहिस्ता. So all of these items, they share a common basis, and that common basis is they all represent sources for funds, and that is why they have an inherent nature of credit. So all of these are. Let me just. Why shouldn't I put it here? These are. Let me use. These are all what we call sources. These are the sources of funds, right? Now, what is the common feature on the debit side of the accounting equation? What is there? The three items on the debit side of the accounting equation: assets, drawings, and expenses. What do they have in common? Now things are easy, right? It's pretty simple now. You can connect the the credit side logic here with the debit side. So if the credit side represents the sources of funds, what does the debit side represent? They represent what? Write your answer here. Outcomes of those funds. Very good, Alicia. Very good. Okay. There's no specific answer to this. You can just put your thought there. Anything that can describe your thought much better. These are the outcomes of those funds. Alicia, you nailed it actually. Do we all agree that everything that happens on the debit side is basically, or let me just put Alicia's answer in more, let's say these are the applications of funds. So these are sources of funds, and these are the application of funds. And that is what connects them together. That is why they carry the same nature, right? जो भी funds आप यहाँ पे generate कर रहे हैं, वो funds, जो भी business अपने लिए funds generate करता है, वो 3 possible sources से वो अपने लिए funds generate कर सकता है. If you disagree with me, then leave a red check mark. मैं अपनी बात complete करने के बाद आके participants window को analyze करूँगा. So businesses, whatever funds they raise, business entity जो भी अपने लिए funds raise कर रही है, वो funds 3 possible sources से raise कर सकती है. या वो funds अपने owner से borrow करके raise कर सकती है, business entity, और वो funds अपनी incomes generate करके raise कर सकती है, right? If you are a trading business, you probably will sell goods to generate your income. Or you can raise your funds through borrowing from third-party sources. So these are the 3 possible sources of funds, and that is what connects them together, and that is why they have the same inherent default nature of being credit. So we call that sources of funds, right? And how these funds are consumed or applied, right? How these funds are applied, application of funds is what we will refer to as debit. So ये funds कहाँ consume होते हैं? या तो आप उन funds से assets खरीद लेंगे, अपने लिए land, building, motor vehicles वगैरह खरीद लेंगे, या वो asset आप अपने expenses में consume कर देंगे. You can pay off your rent and your heating and lighting bills. You can pay off your employees' salaries out of that. You can spend these amounts in expenses, or you will have to spend these amounts because the owner will take it away from you. So your spendings are on the debit side. Your applications of funds are on the debit side. Sorry. We understand this part? Please give me a green check here. The credit, in double entry rules, the credit simply means inherent nature of the right side of the equation, which means capital, revenue and liability. ये 3 तरह के items जो हैं वो credit nature की हैं, और ये तीनों में क्यों credit nature की हैं? क्योंकि they all share one common feature. They all represent sources of funds. That's how the business generates itself sources. And the debit side is what we call the left side, which consists of assets, drawings, and expenses. What do they have in common? They all represent application of the previously generated funds. So जो भी funds आप यहाँ से generate कर रहे हैं, वो यहाँ पे consume कैसे हो रहे हैं? This is the detail over here. So all assets, drawings, and expenses have a default debit nature, and liabilities, incomes, and capital has a default credit nature. I hope we all agree. Amal agrees because Amal cannot put that. Hadia and Madiha Shahzad agree as well because the rest have agreed. Okay, good. Thank you. Now we move on to the next part. So that is the summary of what we have done so far. The default nature of accounting items. Default nature debit किन किन चीज़ों के लिए होती है? आपकी ये 3 चीज़ें debit nature की हैं, और ये 3 चीज़ें आपकी credit nature की. Liabilities, equity, or profits and revenues they have a credit nature by default. Okay. And default nature for debit is assets, drawings, and expenses. Okay. So now we do some practice questions. We do some practice questions now. let me open a new note and bring up a worksheet. This must be it. Okay, so we have practically moved to the second chapter of the book. अभी हमने बुक से नहीं किए क्वेश्चंस, लेकिन जो वर्कशीट्स हैं ये मोर और लेस वही क्वेश्चंस होंगे जो आपकी बुक में आपको मिल रहे होंगे. So let me just summarize everything. What do we mean by debit and credit? So आइंदा जब भी आपके पास एक ट्रांजैक्शन होगी, हमारे पास टाइम कितना है? We have time, 15 minutes. So whenever we have a transaction, take it. So let me over here give you a transaction. Bought, say, stationery. No, let's not bring expenses right now. Bought a vehicle costing $5,000, paying by check. So we can see there are two significant parts of this transaction: the vehicle and the check, right? We can see the duality principle in action here. We can see the debit and credit. Now we have to identify these effects, and now we are going to denote these two effects not as upside or downside or economic cost or economic benefit. वो जो भी हम general expressions पहले use करते आ रहे थे, अब उनको हम discard कर देंगे और उनको replace कर देंगे with more with the only accounting expression we have for that. So we have to sort of decode this transaction into a debit and a credit now. So how do we identify this? Okay. So basically what is happening, our thought process should go like this. So what is happening here, that vehicle is increasing, right? Increase in asset called vehicle, right? Right. And what is the other effect here? The bank decrease in the bank asset, decrease in bank asset, which is also an asset by nature, right? So these are the two effects that we can readily identify, and both of these effects have the $5,000 value common here. Okay, let me not use the same color. Okay. So this $5,000 is the common. So आपका asset called vehicle is increasing by $5,000 and the asset called bank is decreasing by $5,000. That is the effect that we can readily detect. Now we have to translate these effects, or we have to translate this English language sentence, bought vehicle costing $5,000 paying by check. We have to translate that sentence into the accounting language. And the accounting language simply means break it down into one debit entry and one credit entry. That means which particular part belongs to the left side of the accounting equation and what part belongs to the right side of the accounting equation. So how do we do this? The next part we need to, our thought process is, okay, increase in the asset, $5,000, decrease in the bank, $5,000. We identified these objects. Then the next part is, what's their default nature? The default nature is debit because this is an asset. What's the other item involved? Uski default nature kya hai? The other item involved is also an asset. Bank is also an asset, which also has a debit nature, or DR short for debit, right? Not doctor. Okay. It's not doctor, it's debit. It's a strange way of denoting debit, but that's how we do it. So what is happening now, since it is increasing, take it, increase in the default nature debit will be further debited. So since this part is representing increase, the default nature is debit. So अगर आपने किसी debit quantity को further increase करना है, then you'll have to push it further by further debiting it. That's how the thought process should work, right? That's the mathematical way of looking at it. There is an easier, simpler way of looking at it as well, which does not work all the time, but works most of the time. We'll come to that later on. But I'm just going to explain the more reliable way of looking at things. So if a debit natured item needs to go up, that means it needs to be further debited. But if a debit nature item is decreasing, that means the debit nature item needs to move to the negative direction. That means we need to apply the opposite effect. So in that case, it needs to be credited. So डेबिट और क्रेडिट एक दूसरे के ऑपोजिट्स हैं. सो अगर डेबिट को इन्हांस आपने करना है तो उसी क्वांटिटी को फर्दर डेबिट करके आप इन्हांस कर सकते हैं. लेकिन अगर आपने डेबिट को रिड्यूस करना है तो डेबिट का ऑपोजिट फंक्शन अप्लाई करके उसको आप रिड्यूस कर सकते हैं, राइट? मिनाल, आपका माइक ऑन हुआ है बेटे, बोलो. हाँ मिनाल, यू हैव टू आस्क समथिंग. अच्छा, ओके. सो we understand? Basically, I'm just asking you in simpler terms over here. If plus 6 needs to become plus 9, what do we insert here? Right? So, if plus 6 needs to become plus 9, should we insert plus 3 or minus 3 here? Because that's very important, because debit and credit essentially are opposite of each other, just like plus and minus are. So since we are more comfortable with mathematical analogies here, so it will be easier for you to understand that way. So if I ask you that if debit 6 needs to become debit 9, what do we insert here then? Debit 3 or credit 3? It should be debit 3, right? Because it has to be moving on the other, in the same direction, right? If I ask you that a credit quantity of, by nature, if something has a credit nature, it's a credit quantity, and that 1,000 needs to become credit of $800, then what do we put here? How is a credit quantity of 1,000 will become credit quantity of 800? We need to insert certain amount here, right? A debit of $200, absolutely. You can write DR for debit. DR is an acceptable abbreviation for debit. CR for credit. And remember this credit not to be confused with the credit that we use in the term transaction में bought goods on credit, etc., right? So debit of $200, right? Okay. So that is more of a mathematical way of looking at it. So basically now you agree with this chart. Assets have a debit nature by default. ये bracket का मतलब यहाँ पर ये है कि ये इनकी default nature है. And if increases, that means it should be further debited. And if asset goes down, it should be credited, right? Same goes with capital, equity, and liabilities. Let me just address the basic of the accounting equation first, right? Equity and liabilities, they have credit nature to them, right? They have a default credit nature. So that means if a transaction affects them in a way that they go up, that means they will be further credited. And if a transaction affects them adversely, negatively, then they will be debited. So basically, what do we mean by a debit? Debit either means increase in the assets, or it means decrease in obligations. Do you agree with the understanding of the term debit here? Right? Debit simply means left, but left, what does it mean to be on the left side of the equation? That means if an asset goes up, it will be debited, or if an obligation comes down, it will be debited, right? Okay. जल्दी से मुझे बता दें. We understand debit, and मैं साथ में credit भी लिख देता हूँ. And what do we mean by credit? Either you increase your obligation, increase in the obligations, that is represented by a credit effect, or a decrease in assets. So your credit means either your obligations are increasing or your assets are decreasing. Yes or no? Okay. Please give me the green check on participant windows, please. Okay. If you understand the debit, let me just make it smaller here, right? Okay. Good. Madiha already has done it, right? Okay. Now, so now what we are required to do in order to understand the double entry bookkeeping principle, the first thing that we need to learn is to break down a complex English language transaction into an accounting language transaction, which is very simplified. Because what does the debit and credit language, what does it do? It breaks down this complexity of words into your simpler conclusion that इसमें ये debit हो रहा है और ये credit हो रहा है. It may seem daunting initially to understand it properly, just like that. It may seem a bit daunting कि हमारे thought process में ये सब कुछ चल रहा होगा. But there is a simpler way out of it. Remember that second slide where we discussed the cost and benefits? All you have to identify yourself, what is the upside and what's the downside. So for now, this is not the complete definition of debit or credit. This is just a simpler shortcut. It's a workaround to simplify the process of identifying debits and credits. You can simply say the debit is the upside here, or credit is the downside here. So it will be easier for you to analyze most of the transactions into a debit and credit using just the upside and downside. You need to see what's beneficial for you right now as a business entity. So every time a transaction results in the increase of the asset or decrease in the obligation, that goes in your favor. So you're the business entity. So you can denote debit with the upside here. And you can denote the credit as the downside for you, because downside का मतलब क्या होगा? या आपकी obligations बढ़ रही होंगी या आप अपने assets को lose कर रहे होंगे. But again, mind you, this is not the way how debits and credits should be defined or understood. This is just a simple shortcut and workaround just to save time, right? The correct way of looking at debit and credit should be like this: that since assets have a debit nature inherent, so that means if they go up, they should be further debited. If they come down, they should be credited, and vice versa for obligations. So we understand the workaround. देखिए आप ट्रांजैक्शन पढ़ें, अगर आपने सिंप्लीफाइड एनालिसिस यूज़ करना, आप ट्रांजैक्शन पढ़ें, आप उसमें देख लें कि आपकी ब्राइटर साइड ऑफ द स्टोरी जो है उसको आप डेबिट के इफेक्ट से कनेक्ट कर देंगे, और डार्कर साइड ऑफ द स्टोरी इज गोइंग टू बी कनेक्टेड विद द डाउन साइड. राइट, वी अंडरस्टैंड. प्लीज गिव मी अ ग्रीन चेक and then we can start with these exercises here. A green check if we understood the debits and credits here. Good. You need to, I'm recording this lecture and I will share it again on Google Classroom, and I want you, especially the beginners who are doing it for the first time, I want you to watch it again. Maybe आज अगर मैं अपलोड कर दिया तो आज रात के वक्त आप किसी वक्त उसको देखें, अदरवाइज कल की क्लास से पहले एक बार ज़रूर आपने देखना है. ओके. So now we are given a set of transactions here. How much time do we have? Oh, we have just 3 minutes left. So let me just do the first transaction here. मैं दोनों तरीकों से एक ट्रांजैक्शन में कर देता हूँ. एक फॉर्मल तरीके से हम करेंगे और दूसरा हम ज़रा वर्क अराउंड यूज़ करते हुए शॉर्टकट तरीके से उसकी डिस्क्रिप्शन देंगे. Bought office furniture on credit from DISX Limited. This is the transaction. Okay. The upside is that we are getting office machinery, so account to be debited will be here as office machinery, right? Machinery account is going to be here. That's simpler. See how quick that was. Okay. And the downside over here is that our liability towards DISX Limited is increasing, so that should be credited over here, DISX. So that's the easiest way of decoding a transaction into a simple accounting language parts, right? So unlike 1.11 and 12 in the previous chapter, we were given three columns separately: assets के ऊपर क्या effect है, capital पे क्या effect है, and so on. In this case, we're just simply reduced to two columns: what is debited and what is to be credited, right? So the other more formal explanation, which is this one here, this one, if we are to identify it thinking mathematically, so you say, okay, fine, which items are being affected here? There is an office machinery and there is DISX Limited. So what is happening here, right? The office machinery is being asset and DISX is the liability here, right? So what is happening here? Asset is increasing. Asset increases. Asset has a debit nature, right? If asset has a debit nature and asset is increasing, asset has a debit nature, asset is increasing, it should be debited, right? You come to the same conclusion, right? So account to be debited is machinery. Okay. What is happening to DISX Limited? DISX Limited is inherently a liability and a credit balance by nature. And in this case, it's also increasing. And if it is increasing, it should also be credited. So so that's how you come to this conclusion. So we debit machinery account and we credit the DISX Limited account. The upside and downside is a simpler analysis and will work almost 90% of the situations. You will be able to arrive at the correct debit and correct credit, but it doesn't really apply to all of the transactions that we will come across. But for now, it will work smoothly. So all you have to do is just apply that, try 2.1 and 2.2, and we will start our tomorrow's lecture with 2.1 and 2.2's issues. We have run out of time. So if there is any question, you can just stick around for a while. Otherwise, you move on to your next class. Thank you very much for your time.